Hello learners, welcome to the course Migrated Women's Literature. In today's lecture, we will be talking about poetry. Poetry, as defined by Britannica.com, is a literary writing that evokes a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound and rhythm. The word poetry is made from the Greek word poiesis, which means emergence of something that did not previously exist. Poetry has a specific writing style which produces meaning above the surface level or which creates a meaning that is above the literal meaning of the words. There is a very specific thing about poetry, it is that we can convey maximum information in limited number of words. Unlike prose, in poetry we do not need to write elaborated sentences and provide information so as to create a picture of that imaginary world. Here, information gets conveyed in minimum words. A poet shares his or her experiences, imagination and aspirations. Poetry is a medium for a poet to connect with the readers. And the most important thing about poetry is that the literature in the very beginning was in oral form. People used to narrate various stories and this narration was in the form of poetry. They used to narrate different stories, anecdotes, fables in the form of poetry and they passed information from one generation to other generation through the help of poetry. So we can say that poetry could be considered as the first phase of the literature. There are various literary devices that are used in poetry and the use of these literary devices makes poetry exceptional and impressive. Here are certain devices which can be talked about in today's lecture. We have some figures of speech. The very first one is simile. Simile compares two things by using the words like or as. Whereas metaphor also creates a kind of comparison between two things, but it compares two things that actually have no similarity. Another literary device or figures of speech that can be talked about today is hyperbole. Hyperbole, as the name suggests, an exaggerated presentation of some information. It also conveys meaning beyond the literal sense of the word. Next is personification. In personification, a poet or a writer attaches human characteristics to non-human things so as to make them more relatable. We also have many other figures of speech. To name a few, we can talk about oxymoron, which uses words that are completely opposite to each other. We have alliteration where we find the repetition of the same sound or letter in the beginning of the words in any phrase. Assonance also talks about the repetition but of vowel sounds that are repeated. Anaphora is deliberate repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of several successive verses. Chiasmus refers to the grammatical constructions that are repeated in reverse order. And when a poet uses irony in any poem, it means that the poet is creating a contrast between appearance and reality. Let us talk about symbol. The use of symbols in poetry is very important, which adds a unique meaning to the words that are used in that poem. Symbol refers to any person, any object, situation or action that represents something else, often an abstract idea or belief. To explain the concept, I have here used two of the examples from the poems that are part of our syllabus. The very first example is from the poem Letter to a Prospective Immigrant. Here, Lakshmi Gill writes, "And what about that tired myth, Canada the cold? Not a myth, I assure you, don't come naked." Here, the term Canada the cold is symbolically used. The word cold not only refers to the cold weather of the country, but it also refers to the indifferent behavior of the people of Canada. Here the poet says that Canada not only has cold atmosphere, cold weather, but the people are also very rude and hostile towards the immigrants. The coldness of their behavior makes it much more difficult for an immigrant to survive in that atmosphere. Next example is from the poem A Letter for Home. Here the poet says, "I do not bind my tresses in exile, a speck of ash lies on my full plate." The symbolic reference here used is ash. Ash refers to the insults that are heaped upon those immigrants in Canada. So she says that the food that is there on my plate is a result of all those insults. After facing all those insults, then only I have been able to earn something and to create this position for myself. So this food resembles the ash. Here we also find that the poet talks about not binding her hair, which goes to the story of the seer Chanakya, who had vowed to keep his hair untied until he would be able to dethrone the clan of Nanda. We would be discussing about all these things in our detailed lectures. Let us talk about major types of poetry. I have here mentioned some of the most prominent forms of poetry. We have lyric, which is a short poem, while sonnet refers to a 14-lined poem, and haiku is an ancient form of Japanese poetry that has become very popular in the present era all around the world, and it is very remarkable because of its small size. Haiku consists of just 3 lines. And we can also talk about free verse, which is equally popular form of poetry in the postmodern world, because as the name suggests, here the poet has the freedom of using as many lines as he or she wants to, and there is also a freedom of not using any specific rhyming scheme. So this style of writing poetry, which is called free verse, gives lots of freedom to the poet. Another thing that we can talk about is sonnet. Sonnet is very important as well as very famous in English literature, and it was William Shakespeare who brought fame to sonnet. Sonnet actually originated in the 13th century in Italy. The word sonnet itself has been taken from the Italian word sonetto, which means little song. So traditionally there are 14 lines in sonnet. However, Shakespearean sonnet is quite different from Petrarchan sonnet. Next important form of poetry is ode. Ode is that form of poetry which is believed to be taken from the ancient Greece, and it is believed to be written for glorifying something. Let us discuss diaspora and poetry. As we all know that diaspora refers to a situation where people migrate from their homeland and they settle in a new place. And we had also talked about in the previous lectures that diaspora does not represent any specific individual. However, diaspora is a word which is used for the group of people, for the entire communities. We have many diasporic communities in different nations, and here, as we are talking about South Asian poets, we can say that these poets who had migrated from the Indian subcontinent and then later on settled in Canada, they had faced different situations there. Some of those situations were positive, were helpful in bringing out their talent, while many other situations were not very helpful, and those situations had made them suffer in most of the ways. The themes of their poetry are quite similar to each other. However, the handling of those themes and the presentation of those specific themes are unique in itself. The very first theme that these South Asian poets present in their poetry is racism and patriarchy, hostility and discrimination. These are the two things faced by all the immigrants, but the discrimination was faced by these female poets and female writers at two levels. The very first level is they faced discrimination because they were migrants, and the second level, they faced discrimination because they were living in a patriarchal society. They faced discrimination and hostility, they experienced that because they were women. So we can say that these female poets have faced discrimination at two levels and they were doubly displaced. The second form of themes that we come across in diasporic literature is presentation of culture. Culture finds a reflection in their writings. They talk about two cultures, the culture of their homeland, the land that they had left behind, the land that is still alive in their memories, and the land which still has their roots. And the second culture is the culture of their present position, their present land, their present house. So they create a kind of a comparison of these two cultures and present an image of both the cultures together at the same time in their poetry, while one of the cultures is presented as a calm, as a soothing impression, and the other one is presented as a place to struggle with the situations. Another thing that we find in the poetry by these diasporic poets is a presentation of multiculturalism in Canada. Canada is known as a multicultural land. However, these poets show the duality of attitudes experienced by them in Canada. As we all know that there was a time when there was a ban on the immigration in Canada. And we also know that there was a time when the immigrants were neglected, insulted, and they had faced hostility in the land of Canada, and this hostility was in every possible way and every possible form. That is what these poets talk about in their poetry when they say that Canada is a multicultural land. Here we find people from different countries, different regions, people who speak different languages, people who follow different cultures and religions, yet all these forms of multiculturalism, all these examples of multiculturalism could not win against the indifference, against the hostility, and against the rudeness of this place. That is why the poet calls Canada a cold land. Another thing that we find here is lack of information. The immigrant women had suffered a lot in every nation, those migrant females, when they had left their homeland behind, when they followed the male members of their families and they went along with them, they did not know how the life would come to them. They did not know what the circumstances would be, and when they traveled, when they migrated, they had all those imaginations of having a good life ahead. But the things were totally different. They had to face so many hardships. They had to manage in every phase of life. They had to struggle at every level of life. So the plight of these immigrant women, the plight which is a result of their lack of information also, because when these women migrated initially, most of them were uneducated. That is why they did not have much information about the land where they were going. Not only women but males, but men were also uneducated in the very first phase of migration. They also did not have any exact idea of the place where they were going, and they also did not know about the weather, atmosphere, food conditions, culture, traditions, customs. They did not know about anything. So this lack of information contributed to their sufferings. And one of the reasons behind this lack of information was the limited access to the resources. And another reason was not so much developed technology. As in the present time, if we compare the situation with the previous era, with those times, we see that currently we have an access to technology. And before migrating, before leaving our homeland, we can check so many things online. And this availability of technology, this access to the information, strengthens our confidence. It boosts our confidence. And we know that what should we do and what should we ignore. Where should we travel, how to manage other things, and what are the certain specific things that we should learn before going to a new place. So these migrants in that first phase of migration did not have access to any such technology. Therefore, when they reached there, it was a kind of a very tough situation for them. It was a cultural shock for them. And talking about specifically women, we see that females, as always happens in a patriarchal society, that females are supposed to follow the male members of their families. Thus, when these females followed these males who were the breadwinners of the family as well as decision makers of the family, these females in that new land had to suffer at two levels. The first, as I had already mentioned, first level was being a migrant there. The second level was being a female. So suffering outside the house as well as suffering within the four walls of the house also. So these female South Asian poets, they talk about all those traumas, sufferings and plights of women immigrants. As Diane McGifford has written in her book, The Geography of Voice, South Asian writers are a remarkably varied assembly. They do not come tabula rasa nor with begging bowls in their hands, ready to be refashioned as Anglo or Franco-Canadians, but as vibrant, talented people, schooled in the literary forms of their indigenous and adopted languages, in the vernacular forms of English, and in the traditional forms of English literature. South Asian Canadians are proud of their ancient civilizations and Canadian writing. So these women who were educated, talented, professionals, and some of them were academics also. They not only earned recognition for themselves, but they have also brought laurels to their nations. They did not diminish like any other ordinary female immigrant, but they knew how to fight, they knew how to survive, and instead of lagging behind in different areas, different fields, they knew how to win their specific position there in Canada.